The photograph was small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, its edges soft with age, its surface cracked like dry earth. Two children stood at the center, a boy and a girl, their fingers intertwined, their faces calm in the way only children from another century ever seemed to be. At first glance, it felt tender, almost staged to reassure the future that the past had once been gentle, the kind of image that invited nostalgia rather than questions. The date, penciled faintly on the back, read 1910. No one could explain why the image felt heavy, why viewers lingered longer than they meant to, or why some reported a faint sense of unease when looking into the children's eyes. It was only after the restoration began, after the dust was digitally lifted and the shadows coaxed into clarity, that the stillness of the photograph began to fracture. What had once seemed like a neutral backdrop started to suggest motion, as though the world behind the siblings had been interrupted mid-breath. The light no longer fell naturally. The edges of buildings warped. Darkness pooled where it had no right to exist. As more details surfaced, the children's expressions subtly changed. The serenity that once defined them gave way to something tighter, more deliberate. Their hands, once assumed to be joined in affection, now appeared clenched, knuckles pale, fingers gripping with urgency rather than love. It became impossible to tell whether they were comforting each other or bracing themselves. The longer one stared, the more the silence of the image felt unnatural, as if it were suppressing a sound too terrible to survive time. By the time the restoration neared completion, no one referred to the photograph as sweet anymore. It was no longer a portrait of childhood, but a frozen moment taken on the edge of collapse. Whatever disaster had been unfolding, when the shutter clicked, had left no mark on history books, no trace in official records. Yet there it was, preserved in silver and shadow, waiting patiently for someone to finally see what had always been there. The discovery of the photograph happened quietly, without ceremony, tucked inside a mislabeled archival box that had not been opened in decades. It was found during a routine digitization project, the kind meant to preserve fading memories rather than uncover new ones. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about it. Two siblings standing side by side, their small hands joined, their posture formal in the way children were taught to be when facing a camera in the early 20th century. The clothing placed it firmly in 1910, the fabric heavy, the shoes worn but polished, the expressions restrained yet gentle. What made it stand out was not fear or strangeness, but a softness that felt increasingly rare, an image of innocence untouched by the chaos history would later bring. When the photograph was uploaded to a public archive, it began to circulate almost immediately. Viewers shared it with captions that spoke of simpler times, of childhood bonds that felt timeless. Comment sections filled with speculation about the siblings' lives, their names, whether they had grown old together or been separated by war or circumstance. Amateur historians weighed in, pointing out the studio markings and the faint architectural shapes behind them. The image became a point of collective projection, a place where strangers poured their longing for a past that seemed kinder than the present. It was described as comforting, even beautiful, and for a brief moment it served exactly that purpose. The viral attention drew the interest of professional conservators and photographic restorers, people trained to look past surface charm and examine what lay beneath deterioration and time. They were initially motivated by preservation alone, concerned that the cracking emulsion and uneven exposure would soon erase details forever. Requests came in from museums and academic institutions, each offering resources to ensure the photograph could be stabilized and enhanced without altering its authenticity. There was nothing ominous in this decision, no sense that the image concealed anything more than age-related decay. It was simply considered important, a cultural artifact resonating with the public in an unexpected way. As the restoration process was scheduled, anticipation grew online. People wanted clearer faces, sharper lines, more intimacy with the children frozen in the frame. Few questioned why the photograph felt so emotionally charged, why it lingered in the mind longer than thousands of similar images from the same era. It was assumed the reaction was sentimental, a shared human response to youth and connection. The siblings became symbols rather than individuals, their joined hands interpreted as proof of safety, love, and mutual protection. No one yet considered the possibility that the photograph had survived not because it was peaceful, but because it had captured something unresolved, something waiting for the right moment and the right technology to finally be noticed. The restoration began with careful, methodical steps designed to preserve the photograph's integrity while revealing details long buried under a century of wear. Technicians adjusted contrast, corrected warping caused by moisture, and reconstructed missing fragments at the edges where the paper had thinned. At first, the changes were subtle and reassuring, making the siblings' faces clearer and their clothing more defined. The background, however, resisted clarity in a way that felt unusual. Instead of sharpening into a neutral studio backdrop, it produced faint distortions, as though the space behind the children had been stretched or damaged at the moment the image was taken rather than over time. As layers were separated digitally, irregular patterns appeared where uniform tones should have existed. Vertical lines bent slightly inward, suggesting pressure or movement, while shadowed areas thickened into uneven shapes that did not align with typical lighting from early 20th century portrait studios. Experts compared the anomalies with known examples of photographic decay, chemical staining, and exposure errors, but none matched what was emerging. The distortions seemed intentional, frozen in the emulsion rather than imposed by age. It was as if the camera had captured instability in the environment itself, something in motion that refused to resolve into a single, rational explanation. Further enhancement revealed damage inconsistent with indoor photography. Fine particulate marks resembled debris rather than dust, and certain blurred streaks suggested sudden movement across the lens plane. These details implied that the photograph may not have been taken in the controlled calm of a studio at all, but somewhere far less predictable. This raised immediate questions, because the siblings' posture and attire suggested a formal setting, one where chaos would have been impossible, or at least noticeable. The contradiction unsettled the restorers, who found themselves double-checking settings, recalibrating tools, and repeating processes to rule out technical error. The most troubling discovery came when depth correction exposed uneven lighting sources behind the children. Early cameras relied on steady illumination, yet this image showed fluctuations, as if shadows were cast by shifting structures or moving forms. Certain areas appeared overexposed not by light, but by absence, as though something had been there and then violently removed. These inconsistencies hinted at environmental damage occurring at the exact moment the shutter was released. The photograph was no longer a passive record. It was evidence of disruption, quietly preserved in silver grains. As word of these findings spread among the restoration team, the tone of the project changed. What began as a routine preservation effort evolved into an investigation. The background was no longer treated as secondary to the children, but as an active participant in the image. Each enhancement revealed more signs of stress, collapse, or sudden force, all incompatible with the peaceful scene suggested by the siblings' composed expressions. The photograph now felt less like a memory and more like a fragment torn from a larger, violent moment, one that had left its mark not through obvious destruction, but through subtle distortions that only modern restoration could bring to light. The restoration progressed into deeper analytical stages. The background ceased to feel like an abstract space and began to resolve into something disturbingly specific. Through enhanced depth mapping and edge reconstruction, faint silhouettes emerged behind the siblings, shapes that had previously been dismissed as noise or shadow. These forms did not align with decorative backdrops or architectural symmetry common to the period. Instead, they suggested human figures caught in unnatural positions, partially obscured as if frozen mid-motion. Their outlines were blurred not by camera shake, but by interruption, as though the exposure had captured movement too sudden to register cleanly. Further refinement revealed structural elements where none were expected. What had once looked like a soft gradient began to resemble fractured beams, angled walls, and uneven surfaces bending inward. The perspective was wrong for a portrait, skewed in a way that implied the camera was facing a space undergoing rapid change. Some lines converged sharply, indicating collapse rather than design. Restorers noted that these distortions were layered behind the children, suggesting that whatever was happening in the background was unfolding at the same moment the siblings stood before the lens, separated by only a few feet of space and a fraction of a second in time. When contrast levels were pushed beyond what would normally be acceptable, the image briefly revealed something unmistakable. A figure appeared behind the girl's shoulder, face turned away, posture bent as if bracing against impact. Another form seemed to be reaching outward, its arm extended toward the edge of the frame. These were not artifacts created by over-processing. Multiple independent restorations produced the same results. The conclusion became unavoidable that the photograph had captured people, other than the siblings, and that those people were reacting to an unfolding catastrophe. The implication was chilling. The siblings' calm demeanor, once interpreted as innocence, now felt eerily deliberate, as though they had been instructed to remain still while chaos erupted just beyond their immediate awareness. The idea that a photographer could have chosen to preserve a posed image at such a moment raised unsettling questions about intent. Was the shutter released out of habit, denial, or desperation to document something incomprehensible? Or was it simply the last mechanical act before everything fell apart? As more details emerged, the sense of timing became critical. The collapse suggested by the fractured background appeared to be mid-event, not aftermath. Dust, debris, and motion were suspended in the photograph's grain, creating a paradox of stillness and violence. The siblings stood untouched, their figures sharply defined against a world that was literally breaking apart behind them. This contrast gave the image its most disturbing quality, the suggestion that the photograph marked the precise boundary between safety and destruction. By the end of this phase, the restoration team no longer viewed the photograph as a portrait, but as a document of a disaster in progress. The children were no longer simply subjects, they were witnesses. Unknowingly preserved at the center of a moment history had somehow failed to record elsewhere. The hidden figures and collapsing structures transformed the image into a visual contradiction, a serene foreground masking a catastrophic reality, locked together in a single frame that had waited more than a century to reveal its truth once. The evidence of collapse and hidden figures became undeniable. Attention shifted away from the photograph itself and toward the world that must have existed beyond its frame. Archivists began searching for records tied to the suspected location, using clues embedded in the image such as architectural fragments, clothing styles, and the faint outline of what appeared to be a municipal emblem, partially obscured by damage. Census logs, property registries, and early 20th century city directories were cross-referenced in an attempt to place the siblings within a real community. At first, the results were promising, suggesting a small industrial settlement that existed briefly during the first decade of the 1900s. As research deepened, the trail began to fracture. Maps from the period showed inconsistencies, with certain additions marking a cluster of buildings where later prints showed only blank space. Railway records referenced a stop that no longer appeared on any surviving route diagrams. Even newspapers from nearby towns made vague mentions of the area, often in past tense, as though it had ceased to exist suddenly, rather than faded over time. The absence was striking not because of what was found, but because of how much was missing, gaps where routine documentation should have been abundant. Attempts to uncover reports of fires, floods, or industrial accidents yielded little. Official disaster logs contained no entries matching the scale implied by the photograph's background. Hospital records showed a brief spike in unidentified injuries during the same year, but no explanation was attached. Church registries listed several families as relocated, without destination, a term rarely used in that era without further detail. It was as though an entire event had been quietly erased, leaving only indirect traces that hinted at disruption without ever naming it. The most unsettling discovery came from land deeds and zoning documents. The area corresponding to the suspected location was abruptly reclassified within a short span of time, its designation altered from residential or industrial use to restricted land with no public justification. Later records treated the space as if it had always been empty, a geographic omission folded seamlessly into bureaucratic language. No memorials, no inquiries, no official acknowledgement of loss appeared anywhere in the archives. The silence felt intentional, shaped by decisions rather than neglect. Historians involved in the investigation began to question not only what had happened, but why it had been excluded from collective memory. Disasters of similar scale typically left scars in folklore, legal disputes, or generational stories, yet this one seemed to have dissolved entirely. The photograph, in contrast, remained stubbornly present, refusing to align with the clean narrative suggested by the records. Its existence challenged the notion that history was complete, suggesting instead that certain events had been deliberately smoothed over to preserve order or avoid accountability. By the time the archival search concluded, the photograph stood as the most complete surviving evidence of a place that had effectively been removed from official reality. The siblings' image now carried the weight of an unspoken catastrophe, their faces tied to a vanished location that history had chosen to forget, leaving behind a single, fragile proof that something devastating had occurred and then been systematically erased. The final stage of restoration focused on the siblings themselves, returning attention to the very element that had first drawn the world's affection. With the background now understood as unstable and catastrophic, restorers revisited the children's faces and hands, applying techniques refined enough to detect micro-expressions and minute physical tension. What emerged was subtle but undeniable. The boy's mouth, once thought to be relaxed, was slightly compressed, the corners drawn inward as if he were suppressing a reaction. The girl's gaze, previously described as soft, no longer aligned with the lens but drifted just off center, suggesting awareness of something unfolding nearby rather than engagement with the photographer. The most unsettling change appeared in their hands. Earlier scans had shown their fingers gently intertwined, an image of comfort that reinforced the photograph's initial charm. As clarity increased, The shape of the grip changed. Knuckles appeared lighter, tendons more pronounced, the contact no longer balanced or casual. The girl's fingers dug into the boy's hand at an angle consistent with bracing, rather than holding, while his thumb pressed downward with protective force. This was not the touch of posed affection, but of instinctive fear. A reflexive grasp formed in response to imminent danger. Facial enhancement revealed tension in places easily missed by the untrained eye. Muscles around the eyes were tightened, not relaxed, creating an expression that mimicked calm, only because of restraint. The stillness of early photography had masked this detail for generations, allowing the children's composure to be misread as serenity. In truth, the exposure time had captured them in a moment of forced control, standing still while their bodies reacted internally to chaos. They were not unaware of what was happening behind them, they were enduring it. As this realization took hold, the photograph's emotional meaning inverted completely. What once felt reassuring now felt tragic. The siblings were no longer symbols of safety, but of vulnerability, frozen at the exact instant. They understood something was wrong. Their posture made sense in this new context, shoulders slightly raised, bodies aligned toward each other rather than outward. They were forming a barrier, however small, against a world that was collapsing just out of view. The restoration did not alter the image so much as remove the lie imposed by time and assumption. The children had always been afraid. The photograph had simply been misunderstood. Their expressions were not blank because they were calm, but because fear had rendered them silent. The knowledge reframed every earlier interpretation, transforming the image into a record of awareness rather than innocence. The siblings were not posing for memory. They were clinging to each other. At the edge of a disaster, they could not escape. Preserved forever, in the moment they realized what was happening and could do nothing but hold on,